So we're picking up today with the election of 1844, and the Whigs finally nominated Henry Clay. One of the reasons he was so mean to President Tyler was because he felt that the Whig Party had passed him over when they nominated Harrison over him. So Henry Clay finally gets a nomination, and it looked like Martin Van Buren was going to make a comeback and be the leading Democratic candidate, but he wanted to keep the Texas question out of the campaign. Well, that did not fly with Southern Democrats who really wanted to annex Texas as a slave state. So the Democrats in the South rallied behind John C. Calhoun because he was all about annexing Texas. So Van Buren lost control of the Democratic convention, who eventually nominated James K. Polk as the Democrat. So who was Polk? He was a Jacksonian Democrat. He opposed high tariffs. He opposed the National Bank, but he was all about expansionism, taking over more territory and turning it into American United States property. So in the election, Polk won by a very narrow margin. In spite of that, many regarded his victory as this mandate that we were supposed to expand. The United States was to fill out the continent all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So this was just another point for Manifest Destiny. So interestingly, the last thing that Tyler did before he left office and turned the presidency over to Polk was he called for a joint resolution of Congress to annex Texas, and it passed right before Tyler left the White House. So that was the last thing he did as president. So what was Polk like as a person? When he came to the White House, he was about 50 years old, and he was a little bit anxious, but he was a really hard worker. And in the 4 years that he was in office, he was only away from his desk for a total of about 6 weeks. Historians say that Polk was really successful in doing what he wanted to do as president and pushing through the policies that he wanted to. For instance, Polk successfully persuaded Congress to lower the tariff of 1842 and to restore the independent treasury. And then he made himself the spokesperson of American expansionism by committing himself to not only gaining Texas, which they had done through Tyler, but also Oregon and the Southwest, which he successfully did. So Polk acquired Oregon in a treaty with Great Britain, which ended the joint occupation of the territory and established the 49th parallel as the boundary between Canada and the United States. So Polk was very successful as president. So one of the difficulties that Polk faced was war with Mexico. When the United States had annexed Texas a few years before, Mexico broke off polite diplomatic relations with us. So Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor, who would later become the United States president, to defend that disputed border region. And he also sent a guy named John Slidell on a secret mission to Mexico to try to gain that disputed area by negotiation with the Mexican government, because he didn't really want to go to war with Mexico, even though he desperately wanted to expand into that territory. So the Mexicans rejected Polk's offer to buy the territory in question, and as well as part of New Mexico and California. And beyond that, they also reasserted their claim to Texas. So Mexico reclaimed Texas. So a Mexican attack on American troops north of the Rio Grande provided Polk with a pretext to declare war. And he said, "American blood has been shed on American soil," even though it wasn't technically ours yet. So although the American force was smaller, it was better led and better supplied. So you know that part in the military hymn at the beginning, it says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli." This is what that song is referring to. The halls of Montezuma is talking about our war with Mexico. So Polk demonstrated real ability as a military planner, but he faced a lot of domestic opposition, especially from people in the North who did not want to go to war with Mexico. Abraham Lincoln was serving like his one term in the Senate at this time, and he voted against going to war with Mexico. He was one of the few that did. And the fact that Polk's leading generals were Whigs kind of hampered his conduct in war. But anyway, Zachary Taylor quickly occupied northern Mexico, and some settlers who were led by John C. Fremont were able to establish an independent Republic of California. So Winfield Scott was another great leader during this war and would be during the Civil War as well. But American troops under Winfield Scott landed near Veracruz and moved toward Mexico City. So amid the hardest fighting of the war, Scott's forces moved into Mexico City, and on March 9th, 1847, he and his men laid siege to the city and forced it to surrender in 3 weeks with almost no loss to their own men. So Winfield Scott's campaign in Mexico has been called the most brilliant campaign of modern times. So after the war was over, Polk had to come up with some type of peace agreement with the Mexican government. And so he sent a guy named Nicholas P. Trist to negotiate with the Mexican government on a peace treaty. And so Trist joined Winfield Scott at Veracruz, and they instantly disliked each other because Scott considered it a personal dishonor to have to defer to what he considered a pawn of the State Department. So he found this insulting. So Trist sent a 30-page bossy/bureaucratic letter explaining his assignment, and Scott was annoyed but realized that the cause could not be advanced if those two were quarreling. So eventually all was well between them as Trist got really sick, and Winfield Scott sent him guava, which is like a tropical fruit from Mexico. It's kind of like lemon but less sharp. But it was a guava marmalade, and after that the two became friends. So Trist and Winfield Scott found a way to get along. But Trist was unable to negotiate with Mexican peace commissioners until January of 1848, and Polk did not understand why it was taking so long. But after reconsidering his initial offer to Mexico, which was $30 million for New Mexico and California, Polk recalled Trist, who ignored the order, and he did so with Winfield Scott's backing. So this was pretty gutsy for a quote-unquote pawn of the State Department to ignore a presidential order. But anyway, Trist stayed, and he sent a 65-page letter to the president about why he would not be recalled. And he realized that the Mexican government might back out or refuse to send someone to sign if he delayed. So Trist proceeded to negotiate the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. This was the treaty that ended the war. And I want to say this was on the DBQ last year, and probably won't be on there this year. But the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was the treaty that ended the war. And this was where Mexico agreed to accept the Rio Grande as its border with Texas and to cede CEDE, New Mexico and Upper California to the United States. So in return, the United States agreed to pay Mexico $15 million, and the Senate was pretty much forced to ratify this treaty, even though Polk had wanted more land than he received, and some of the senators did as well. This war was already becoming increasingly unpopular, so they just went ahead and signed the treaty. Trist ended up being fired and was not paid for his time in Mexico, so he just retired to private life, and on his deathbed, the Senate gave him $14,000 for his time in Mexico. So in short, what you need to know about this treaty is that it was signed in 1848, and basically the United States gave Mexico $15 million, and Mexico gave up all land in Texas and granted the United States what is now New Mexico and California. So that's the short of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. One of the issues that territorial expansion brought up was the issue of slavery. What would happen in all of these new territories that were now added to the United States? Would they be free or would they be slave? Would it mess up the balance in the Senate between free and slave states? So this unresolved issue came back to the forefront of American politics. And the Constitution did not give the federal government any control over slavery in the states, but Congress did have authority over the territories. So during the Mexican-American War, Congressman David Wilmot proposed an amendment prohibiting slavery in any territory acquired by Mexico, and this was known as the Wilmot Proviso. And this passed in the House, but not in the Senate, where the Southerners held the balance of power there. So Calhoun countered this by introducing resolutions that argued that Congress had no right to bar slavery from any territory. So two compromises were offered here, and one of them, which was endorsed by President Polk and most Southerners, supported a plan to extend the Missouri Compromise line to the Pacific. If you remember, when we talked about the Missouri Compromise, they came up with the 3630 parallel. And so Southerners in Congress and Polk suggested, why not just extend that line all the way to the Pacific Ocean? And if territory is above that line, then it will be a free state. And if it's below that line, then it can be a slave state. Most Southerners backed this, but Northerners really did not. And so another option was proposed by Senator Lewis Cass of Michigan. And he said, why not let the local settlers determine the issue of slavery in their territory? And this came to be called popular sovereignty. And this was one of the things that presidential candidate Stephen Douglas would become really popular for, his endorsement of popular sovereignty. Okay, so the election of 1848. The issue of slavery had become really popular in this election. And so the Whigs nominated war hero Zachary Taylor, and the Democrats nominated Lewis Cass, the guy we just talked about, who was the father of popular sovereignty, or this idea that the states or the territory should decide if their territory or state will have slaves or not. And then Martin Van Buren finally made somewhat of a comeback, and he was nominated by the Free Soil Party. And so the Free Soil Party was a combination of the barn burners, called the barn burners because they would burn down a barn to get rid of the rats. They were named that for their radicalism, and the Liberty Party. And they joined together to form the anti-slavery Free Soil Party. And so they nominated Van Buren. So Taylor won this election by a narrow margin, but the Free Soilers did manage to get about 10% of the vote. So that's pretty good for a non-mainstream political party. But the primary significance of this election was in the growth of the anti-slavery forces. Abolitionism became an increasingly popular movement during this time. So another important thing that happened during this time period was the California Gold Rush. Between 1849 and 1860, over 200,000 people went to California in search of gold. And the massive immigration reduced California's Spanish population to a smaller minority. So order was difficult to maintain among large numbers of men seeking fortunes and isolated from women. So it was very difficult to keep these people in line. And the ethnic conflict, the many diverse ethnicities in the California region were also contributing to the disorder there. So Taylor proposed admitting California directly as a state and letting them decide for themselves about slavery. Again, that's called popular sovereignty. So the Californians drew up their own constitution that outlawed slavery, which of course outraged the Southerners. And so Southerners began to say that they'd have to choose between secession and surrender. And so they couldn't believe that President Taylor would allow this, since he owned a plantation with more than 100 slaves himself. But he was above all a nationalist, not a slaveholder. So the admission of California as a free state would tip the balance in the Senate in favor of the North. So at this point in time, a compromise was necessary to prolong the inevitable Civil War. And so this was proposed by Henry Clay, never a president, but always a compromiser. And in short, this did a couple of things. It installed the Fugitive Slave Act. And the Fugitive Slave Act said that if someone in the North found a fugitive slave, they had to return it to the South. So harsher fugitive slave laws. It also banned the slave trade in D.C., not slavery itself, but the slave trade. It also admitted California as a free state, and it instated popular sovereignty in the Mexican cession. So lands gained from Mexico were given the right to decide for themselves if they wanted to be a slave state or not. So this will take us into our next chapter, which will talk more about the causes of the Civil War.